And in my mind, I see a couple of slender boys holding box cutters on the passengers in each plane, and I no longer believe that fairy tale. Plane passengers are hidden from view by the high seats of the plane, and even an old street kid like me knows enough to wrap a sweater or jacket around your arms, which immediately negates any tiny blade on a box cutter. Planes are usually loaded with professional athletes. There are football players and wrestlers who weigh over 300 pounds who can move like cats, hockey players, soccer players, boxers, martial arts devotees, etc. See the 300-pound linebacker in row 20? The first thing he would do is wet his pants laughing at the demanders, then he would become enraged because he soiled himself. The only danger to the plane after that would be the decompression that follows because he was stuffing their heads through the window. Where does that leave all the recorded phone calls made from the cell phones on the plane?
Good evening. Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts. The search is underway for those who are behind these evil acts. I've directed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and to bring them to justice. We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbored them.
And of course, we all know the result. Following the attacks came the invasion of Afghanistan. The stated reason was to capture bin Laden. When it turned out he couldn't be found, the reason switched to freeing the Afghan people from the Taliban. Then in 2003 came the invasion of Iraq. A country openly acknowledged as having no responsibility for the 9/11 attacks.
Venezuela's President Hugo Chavez again lashed out at the United States. He told supporters in Caracas it was plausible that the US government was involved in the September 11th attacks to justify its subsequent offensives in Afghanistan and Iraq.
What did Iraq have to do with what?
The attack on the World Trade Center.
Nothing, except for it's part of, and nobody's ever suggested in this administration that Saddam Hussein ordered the attack. Iraq was the lesson of September 11th is take threats before they fully materialize, Ken. Nobody's ever suggested.
Oh, haven't they?
There is a tie between Iraq and what happened on 9/11.
You can't spell Condi without the word con.
Part of the reason we went into Iraq was the main reason we went into Iraq at the time was we thought he had weapons of mass destruction. It turns out he didn't, but he had the capacity to make weapons of mass destruction. But I also talked about the human suffering in Iraq, and I also talked the need to advance a freedom agenda.
The official reason given for invading Iraq was that their leader had a stockpile of chemical weapons, something that the Americans and British had supplied him with years earlier.
Isn't there a problem for us in the West of honesty about the reason for going to war in Iraq, and that was weapons of mass destruction?
I don't think that was a lie. We went to war in large part because of the concern that weapons of mass destruction in the hands of the Saddam Hussein regime, a regime that used such weapons, in particular nerve gas,
and was supplied by the United States and Britain with these weapons of mass destruction.
No, I don't believe that's accurate.
Well, yes, they were. Most of the weapons of mass destruction from Saddam Hussein weren't built by him. The machine tools and the ingredients for his biological weapons, they all came from other countries, many of them from this country and Britain.
I don't think that's right. I really think that
it's on the record. In the Library of Congress.
I think the premise of your question is wrong.
Mr. Fife had only to look up this congressional record of a U.S. Senate inquiry in 1992. It shows that the U.S. government approved the sale of biological weapons to Saddam Hussein. The suppliers were this company in Maryland and Porton Down in Britain. If you really want to know the truth about the state of Iraq's weapons of mass destruction before the invasion, listen to Colin Powell in February 2001. He states clearly that there was no threat from Saddam Hussein.
He has not developed any significant capability with respect to weapons of mass destruction. He is unable to project conventional power against his neighbors.
And this is Condoleezza Rice, Bush's national security advisor, in July of the same year, saying the same thing, putting the lie to their own propaganda.
We are able to keep arms from him. His military forces have not been rebuilt.
And that, many believe, was the truth, a truth that was covered up and conveniently forgotten after September the 11th, when Bush and Blair decided to attack Iraq. They found no weapons of mass destruction, no links with Al-Qaeda, no nuclear weapons, no 45-minute threat.
It turns out the only weapon of mass destruction that Saddam had in his arsenal was the black gold that everyone had been dying for. When no chemical weapons were found, the reason switched to giving freedom to the Iraqi people. Ironically, something that had been taken away from the American people under the Patriot Act. And Saddam had been stealing the Iraqis' freedom since the Americans had put him into power in the first place. Saddam continued to imprison and torture his people even during the time that he and the Americans were still lads. Following the invasion of Afghanistan, the US government succeeded in installing their puppet from Unocal, Hamid Karzai, as the new Afghan president. In December 2002, Karzai approved the construction of a Unocal pipeline across Afghanistan, something that Bush, Cheney, and the rest of their buddies at Unocal and Halliburton had wanted since 1997, going so far as to invite the Taliban over to their country and discuss such a deal. 8 years on, and the situation for the Afghan people hasn't improved, with many saying that they were better off under the Taliban. What has improved, though, is the production of opium, something that the Taliban had almost succeeded in eradicating in 2001. Since the invasion, it's skyrocketed, especially in regions patrolled by foreign troops. Guess where that's heading? Meanwhile, the hunt for bin Laden has proved as elusive as Saddam's WMDs. Here's a tip: perhaps they should read his obituary in the Egyptian papers, or check with the various other sources, such as this. The Israeli sources said Israel and the United States assess that bin Laden probably died in the US military campaign in Afghanistan in December. They said the emergence of new messages by bin Laden are probably fabrications. Or this one. Pakistan's president says he thinks Osama bin Laden is most likely dead because the suspected terrorist has been unable to get treatment for his kidney disease. An unnamed US official described this as a decent and reasonable conclusion. So if he's most likely dead, and the Taliban itself had nothing to do with 9/11, why are the foreign troops still in Afghanistan?